what you're going to hear, my recommendation isn't sexy by all means. It's the boring piece that is so critical in times of, budget cuts, but it's clean your data, spend the time to make sure the data that you have is crisp, accurate, fully filled out.
Welcome to Agents of Change, a podcast about the future of B2B marketing, featuring insights from executives at top agencies. I'm Danielle O'Neil with Leadtail. Let's hop on in. Hi, welcome back to Agents of Change. I'm so excited to welcome Adrianna Shukla today. She's the Senior Director of Marketing over at DemandScience, and she has a great background in demand gen, go-to-market, and technology. So we can't wait to pick her brain on all things B2B market strategy. Hey, Adrianna, welcome.
Thanks, Danielle. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Adrianna, like you said, and I'm the Senior Director of Marketing here at DemandScience. I have a wide background of a bunch of different areas in marketing, specifically, how tech, relieves some of the areas of stress and frustration for whether it be the demand gen side of things, whether it be technology, website, SEO, go-to-market, how all those things can play together. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk about that with you guys.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited about this conversation. Anybody that's spoken with you knows that you're focused on and really passionate about demand gen and how it's going to help marketing grow those funnels that our sales team is always interested in. One particular area is through ABM, which, as we know, that's a very hot topic right now. So what would you tell these organizations about their ABM efforts now? And as we're looking at the months ahead, where should they focus those?
Yeah, that's a good question. When people in the industry talk about the definition of ABM, you tend to get different answers from everyone. And a majority of times, I've heard it being used as a tactic within a full strategy. ABM is the full strategy. That's not just marketing, but it's sales and marketing should be collaborating on to get target accounts into your funnel for future conversion points. Over the years, account-based marketing has shifted in many different ways with people deeming best practices, but at the core of it, it's always being that you or I want to target as granularly as possible to get our target accounts into the funnel, right? So there are many parts of an ABM strategy, like making sure that you have the right target account list. Do you have those right people? Making sure your tech stack aligns and supports you with that. And then, just making sure that you have one or two messages that you're really trying to target them with. What are those pain points? Things like that. So I know every marketer, including myself, thinks about this day in and day out. How do I get the people on my account list converted and in my funnel, and there are things, I'm constantly thinking about this. And, I do suggest a couple things to people, as kind of my starting point for myself. I gather a list of websites that talk about information in relation to things that your product solves for, wiki pages, information that websites are in publications, YouTube channels even, things like that are solving for maybe what your product is doing, and retarget your advertising towards people that are reading those materials or learning from them. So let's say you sell a product for SEO and you look at pages that talk about all forms of SEO that maybe your product assists with, then retargeting folks that are reading those materials with their advertising, and going into your advertising platform and doing that. Second is I take a hard look at the company's competitors. So, for DemandScience, I'm looking at our competitors always, and that encompasses both organic and your standard competitors. You have your standard competitors that you're talking about internally, but you also have your organic competitors that you need to be wary of, and maybe they don't directly align with 100% of your features or things you're trying to push, but they are, organically speaking, from search keywords and things like that, competing with you to get into that space. So yeah, so I look at, our competitors' review sites, and I look at what are the areas that are areas of contention for their customers. what are areas that maybe their customers are having difficulty with? And sometimes then I take those pain points and I turn them into messaging that we could potentially use to solve for it, if we can solve for it, right? And so, if they're having trouble with support, then we run a campaign on how we directly support them, whether we handhold them, whether we provide them resources or whatever it may be, that could potentially be something that they can utilize. And then I guess outside of that, we have difficult times ahead. So, making sure that we're listening to our customers more, because with an ABM strategy, you want to make sure that you can tailor your message to hear their pain points or difficulties that they're having, so that you can have a long-term relationship with them. Because if they feel heard and they feel like you can, make their job easier, then they'll stick with you, right? And they feel like they're actually going to have a long-term partnership with you versus just here's your tool, good luck.
Right.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and you really kind of hit the nail on the head there. That personalization piece is really what's going to set you apart versus all the other messages that they're going to receive from anyone else.
Right. And people struggle today with that personalization. It's how creepy is it with personalization? How creepy do you get, right? And so it's like if you
don't put the kids' names in the messages.
right, exactly. If you're looking at some of these pain points and things like that, you're subtly personalizing to them based off of that, but you're not directly saying it, right? And so I feel that's a really great way to incorporate something to incorporate into your strategy as you're thinking about it. And then the last part is the almighty intent data, to make make holistic decisions on who your sales should follow up with for your efforts, prioritizing them versus just a shot in the dark, making sure that you're utilizing intent data to the best of your abilities. So
absolutely. And talking about demand gen, let's talk about this intent data. We know that it's important. So how can orgs use it to aggregate the list for ABM targeting? And what have you seen work and where have maybe people fallen short?
Yeah, that's a good one. Intent data. I mean, I know several, get anxiety when we talk about intent data and all the different sources that are out there. It's like word vomit. It's everyone has intent data, many sources of intent data, and the single most frustrating thing that I know probably everybody can resonate with is that with all of these sources, it's like you pay a good hunk of money in change for all of these sources, right? And it's how do you know how to properly utilize them all together to their fullest, and don't pay money for something if you don't have a good strategy around it and how you're going to utilize it. And that's my biggest recommendation is, there's a lot of great intent data sources. And, I'm first to say that when I see a really great intent data platform, I'm like, oh, I could really use that information. I want to jump all over it. I just want to sign the contract. And, a lot of marketers, including myself in the past, have just purchased, and then they're overwhelmed with the amount of data that they're provided. And sometimes they kind of just sit there, and it's like, oh, I'll reference them every once in a while or whatever. And my biggest advice is to be strategic about who you choose for your intent data sources at each stage of the funnel. Break it out. Here's my top funnel. Here's my middle funnel. Here's my bottom funnel intent data. And so, you have really those third party, second party, first party. And so if you break it down into that funnel, you've got top of funnel with third party intent data. You've got middle funnel, which is probably your second party data. And then you've got your bottom funnel, which is your first party. And if you use third party intent data sources, well, like DemandScience, for instance, you'll know which accounts in your target list are engaging and using that to target your advertising. But then you have second party intent data, like say Trust Radius or G2. You'll find out who has intent on purchasing your product and can then take that, and find out how to target them as well. Bringing that data into your automation system at that point. These people are, searching for me on Trust Radius and G2 and comparing me maybe to a couple different tools. Taking that, bringing it into your automation system, and then run middle funnel campaigns based on that information. And then you have your first party intent data, which is kind of your bread and butter, right? The thing that's probably, well, in some cases free, right? Which you can take that and make decisions on segmentation or tailor your content based on, what they're doing on your site or what they're interested in, and send people an email, or change your content on your site based off of that to really like tailor the information. So like I try to look at it in the funnel format just to remind myself of these tools and how I can properly utilize them throughout the way. It's not easy, but once you get the intent data source for each stage of your funnel, it really helps to fill each stage with like actionable insights, and that's the most important, is making sure that you have really defined actionable insights from your sources, right? So
yeah, and that kind of leads perfectly to the next point of this. We know that it's really important for us to define these audiences and to start thinking about this. So getting granular is going to be an important piece of this when we're targeting, but with budget decreases coming, how can you still get that level of granular reporting if you can't increase your budget to achieve it, let's say?
Right. Everybody's struggling right now with the the hard conversation that you end up having, saying, hey, your budget's getting cut or your budget's getting decreased, or even staying flat. Sometimes you have all these great plans to grow in the future, and all the great things that you can do. And, it's like, oh, I have to stay flat. Okay. So like, I recommend going back to the basics, like oftentimes as marketers, we see this shiny new tool.
We like all the new toys.
Right. We want to see it. We want to purchase it. So I think at the beginning of the pandemic, people went into shopping overload and purchased tech left and right to kind of, make up for the fact that we're all remote, and I guess what you're going to hear, my recommendation isn't sexy by all means, it's the boring piece that is so critical in times of, budget cuts, but it's clean your data, spend the time to make sure the data that you have is crisp, accurate, fully filled out, making
Can
sure
we just get an amen for that? Like, please clean your data.
Exactly. Like, and it's not fun. It's sometimes the work that, you spend so much time on and then doesn't get really noticed by maybe the executives or whatever. But if you properly do that and make sure that it's all filled out, then you can go into your data and have that to analyze it, and making sure that, are there signals in the data that you already have, like upselling, renewals, retention, that you could use for your targeting, like utilizing those people that you already have and the insights that you already have to then make those decisions, like look at companies you may have lost in the past. Look at the closed reason. Why was it not the right timing? Was it the wrong buyer? Could you set up a meeting? Maybe they weren't able to, create a campaign to re-engage with them, re-engage with those people based off of that. And, making sure that your UTM parameters are granular with like location, timing, touch points, making sure those are all documented in your systems for future use, and going back to like my original point a bit ago, like listen to your prospects, like listen to your customers. They will not spend money unless they feel confident in you as a provider and that you are solving a pain point for them immediately, because when you sit on these calls and, I get prospected all the time, it's like, okay, well, yeah, you have a great tool, but how is that, where's the ROI for me? What pain point are you solving for me that really can help me? So, but on the lines of, we don't have money and, maybe budgets are being cut, go back to the simple free data like Google Search Console, Google Analytics, interactions on your website that you can really get, valuable insights from, just starting there with how people are getting to you. How are they getting to you? When they do, what are they doing on your site? What are they truly interact with, so that's kind
When I
of
look, like, don't reinvent the wheel.
right.
It's so simple as that. Just there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You've got the data, you've got the information. just look at it again. For most of our clients and our customers, I'm sure for you too, they have these lists that they may not have looked at in a year. So let's go back to these. Let's figure this out. Well, as we're talking about audiences and customers, in a previous chat that we had, you had mentioned something that really stood out to me. When thinking of customers, brands really need to get a better handle on who their customers are and how their products can make their jobs easier,
Right.
especially during these economically difficult times for the different industries. So, how would you advise these brands on really honing in on that messaging?
Yeah, that's a good one too. I'd say kind of going back to the customer pain points here and figuring out, I don't know about anybody else, and maybe I'm just a crazy marketer, but I'm spending my time reading, Reddit streams, looking through even TikToks about what people are saying on comments, on uh, I think there's there's a girl that I forget exactly her handle, but she's like corporate Natalie, I actually think she is, and I'll
Yes,
read
yes, I know her.
and
Love
she's
handle.
awesome. She's hilarious, and I'll read comments on things like that, and see where people's pain points are, what are they having, even in the workplace, because you may be able to tailor your message to the feature that you have based on what people are saying, right? So, and just the other day, I was on the phone with a customer for like a testimonial recording, and I stopped the recording and just chatted with him. I wanted to understand like his day to day, what he really needed to succeed and what was his company focusing on. And therefore, what stress was he focusing on at the standpoint, like what was a big issue? And usually people are like, I just want to bring in revenue. I just want to bring in the money so that my budget gets increased halfway through the year. Right. So I think that's my recommendation, is just to really focus in on the customer pain points, maybe even go to the review sites. Like I said earlier. Yeah.
Well, and as we're thinking about like the content piece of it, what about content syndication from an SEO and brand awareness perspective?
Yeah, yeah. In relation to content syndication, I'd probably say like take your most valuable content and you can look at the data there. The piece that gets maybe the most traffic or solves a major pain point for your target audience. Once you figure out what that is, get a content syndication provider or syndicate the content yourself, to get in
Yep.
front of the right people, at the right time. People you may have not been able to get in front of, in normal circumstances. Expand your audience for brand awareness. It's like,
Yeah.
that's why content syndication is there, is to really like expand your audience, get in front of people that maybe you aren't able to get in front of right now,
Yep.
and really get in front of them at the right time. DemandScience does do this. It gets your content into those kind of harder to reach places in front of the people you may not be able to reach on your own, and then gets you quality opt-in leads that can then ultimately convert faster for the sales funnel,
Yeah.
which, as we all like to have, is making you the star of the show when you start to get all those, leads
Yeah.
that maybe you weren't able to get before, right?
Exactly. Yep.
But I see content syndication as kind of a always on running machine, something that can
Yeah.
just run and make your life easier by bringing in those top of funnel leads for you to be able to then, take and maybe bring them directly down the funnel or nurture.
I know you've got thoughts on this, as the importance of your partners from that media perspective when it comes to the content syndication.
Right, right. So, when you're selecting a partner, there's partners out there from paid partners to
Mhm.
free partners for content syndication, like Outbrain, Taboola, there's a variety out there, and DemandScience is just one of them, but there are a variety out there that people have been using for years, and so it's really finding, okay, maybe you have two providers, two different types of content that are running with them, and you can either do free content syndication or you can do paid. And, with budget decreases, you may need to do the free for a little while, but, paid may be something that can be an always on type,
Mm-hmm.
running machine, that maybe you get better ROI with, say, a partner, so that you don't have to do the work there yourself.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
smaller teams, at least, as we start to see, teams getting smaller, unfortunately, which is, the worst to see out there.
Mm-hmm.
You may just need that additional provider to help you.
So let's shift gears here a little bit. You actually touched on this a little bit, and I want to go back to it. MQLs.
Okay.
MQL. We hear it all the time. It
Right.
is the marketing hotbed. Every conversation, MQLs are going to come up at some point. In a previous conversation that you and I had, you had actually mentioned how marketing is not MQLs anymore. Now it's all about those efforts and that attribution. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. We always, we all want to be as easy as, here's your MQL, and we bring thousands of them in, and here's your leads. But then you look at it and it's like, did these people convert? It's like, it's exhausting because it's like, okay, how many leads did you bring in this month? Okay, say I brought in 1,000 leads this month, but only 2 of them ended up as opportunities and then booked revenue. It's like, I would say whatever I was doing from a marketing standpoint was probably not working if you have 1,000 and then you're only getting 2. So it's like, they weren't the right people. Was I targeting the right area? Maybe the targeting was off or the content was off that I was trying to do. So now if I could narrow that and say I got 50 leads and 45 of them converted to opportunities, then I would say the people I was bringing in are solid and ready to buy. So instead I've switched to looking at how many sales qualified leads there are that have converted to opportunities, because that will give you a true understanding of how strong the leads are that you're bringing in. Then I'd want to take a look at, what touch points drove those leads to become known people in our database. I want to look at what items contributed to those people, like progressing down the funnel, and focus on those tactics. That kind of gets into, like attribution modeling. And, do you do a multi-touch? Do you do a first touch, last touch? There's a variety of different models that you can have out there, and for me, I particularly like a U-shaped model, which is a multi-touch attribution model, which you have your first touch and last touch get the most percentage of the revenue coming in, but then you have all the touch points underneath that kind of also still attribute to that revenue. So, just making sure that you have your tech stack kind of set up for that, and, getting that proper attribution funneling in there so you can see what's actually working and what's not.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest part of it, is having that visibility and understanding. Because to your point, if you're only converting 1, are you getting them at the wrong part of their buying process? Are we not hitting them really currently where they are within the decision-making process? And then are we giving them the right messaging? And what we've seen, and I'm sure you see it too, is a lot of times it's the same messaging no matter what part of the process they're in, and they're not alternating that messaging. And that's where you're going to lose those funnels.
Right. And, when we look at MQLs, sometimes we're in funnel vision, we're in
Very
a funnel,
much, yeah.
like, here's your MQLs. Here you go, guys. Hopefully they convert. But, ultimately we're in this together. We need to be aligned. And, if we're sending over to sales things that just ultimately aren't converting, well, then the business isn't going to be successful. And we're all here to get the paycheck. So we got to make sure that we get that paycheck in the end of the day, right? So
exactly. Fantastic. Well, Adrianna, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I think probably every data junkie out there is celebrating you right now. And they're embracing their own analytical side as well. But we look forward to working with you on hopefully other projects down the line and getting to know you better.
Yeah, it's been really great. When you first reached out to me, it was really great to have conversation and just get this relationship started. So thank you for allowing me to speak here and wanting to hear my thoughts on things. So I really appreciate that. And I hope you guys have a, great rest of your, future year. And I hope everything goes well.
Thanks, Adrianna.